The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for calling in to the overview of key proposed changes for Rev 5 of the Energy Star Multifamily New Construction Program webinar. We will start the presentation in a few minutes to allow additional attendees to dial in. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Before we launch into the content, I wanted to share some tips for participating in today's webinar. To expand or collapse the webinar panel for better viewing, click on the small orange box with the white arrow in the top left of the software panel. There are options for accessing the audio from today's program. If you are dialing in by phone, please be sure to use the phone call button as selected. Alternatively, you can select computer audio. Everyone will be muted throughout today's program. If you have any question, please enter it in the questions box. We will try to respond to typed questions as we go and attempt to answer any remaining questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Please note this webinar is being recorded and all registrants will be sent a copy of the slides. Additionally, a link to the recorded version of the presentation will be available after the webinar. With that, we'll begin.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome to the overview of the key proposed changes for Rev 5 of the Energy Star Construction Program. My name is Rebecca Hudson, and I am the technical manager for the Multifamily New Construction Program. And we have a very full agenda today. I'm going to start with the primary goals for Revision 5. Welcome back, everybody who was able to attend the earlier webinar at 1 p.m. on the proposals for the Single Family New Homes Program. I'll cover the highlights that are also applicable for the Multifamily New Construction Program. And then I'm going to dive into the overview of the 7 key proposals for multifamily new construction.
Hey, Rebecca, I'm going to pause you real quick. I think we're getting some feedback that your audio is going in and out a little bit. I know we tested this out earlier.
Okay. Let's see. I will shift. Okay, let's see at the end of the slide, stop me if it doesn't even out. So the first key proposal is to limit townhouse eligibility to single family new homes. Next up is requiring the multifamily workbook for all buildings. Third is streamlining insulation and reduced thermal bridging detail. Fourth is transitioning to Track A, HVAC grading by rater, and sunsetting Track B. Fifth is streamlining the mandatory lighting requirements. Sixth, consolidating the ASHRAE path performance target and documentation and adding a fuel neutral approach. And finally, transitioning to whole building modeling path in California. So those are the main 7 proposals I'll be going through, and then I'll be covering next steps, because before we finalize any of these proposals, we want to get your input.
So before you move on, sorry to interrupt you again, it does seem like it's a little bit better, but we are getting a lot of comments that, even for myself, it does seem to cut in and out. When your audio's on, it's very clear, but then it disappears a little bit.
Okay. I'm going to try one thing. One moment. I'll give it one more shot here before I switch to the cell phone audio and see if that fixes it. So far you haven't missed anything because everything's on the slide, but we're going to go into our primary goals for Revision 5. I just need to get back in. There we go. Okay. So in general, for revisions, we release our revision mostly annually at this point. And these revisions are intended overall to simplify, clarify, and improve the program. So unlike a new version, which increases the stringency, revisions are maintenance and intended to improve the program and not increase the stringency. Overall, for this revision, we have a few goals, and these align with the goals you've already heard for revision 14 for the single family new homes program. So you might be hearing them again for those who were able to join that one. The first is building on a theme we've been discussing this year to enhance the quality assurance and quality control of our program. So we want to do that in a couple different ways, both by reducing the number of requirements that are not rater verified and also standardizing the documentation. So I just want to do a sound check before I go to the next goal.
Much better, thank you.
Okay, great. So next up, the second goal is to reduce the program complexity by creating more linear certification process with fewer decision points. If you're familiar with multifamily new construction program, you know there's a lot of different flexibilities built in, but we're going to try and streamline a few of those to decrease decision points. And the third is to simplify the program by exchanging several lower impact mandatory measures for performance-based approaches. So we think that by eliminating some of those mandatory requirements, we can help get projects passed with fewer trip points for certification, but still using those performance-based approaches have buildings that meet our promise. Okay, so those are the primary goals for the revision, and I'm going to just briefly mention that there were a few different proposals mentioned earlier for single-family new homes that are also applicable for multifamily new construction, including streamlining the air sealing details, narrowing the scope of builder verified items, and sunsetting the water management system builder requirements. So these are all similarly applicable to multifamily new construction, and for more information on these, if you weren't able to attend, please look for the recording when it is posted, most likely tomorrow. Okay, so getting into the new proposals, first being limiting townhouse eligibility to single-family new homes. Just going to go through a little bit of background. In currently, townhouses are.
Rebecca, before you continue, the audio is starting to cut again. So if you have another way to, if you want to do the cell phone call in, maybe good to just pause here before you get into the meat. And sorry to folks on the line. We did test the audio before we started today, but technology defeats us sometimes.
See if you are able to hear.
Yes,
Yes, we
keep
can hear
going.
you.
We'll see if it's
Okay,
maybe a little bit louder. Yep.
let's see if this is better now that I am connected. So I will try and check in at the end of this slide. So as I was saying, townhouses are the only building type eligible to be certified through both the single family and multifamily programs. We had added this originally to accommodate those edge cases where townhouses would be attached to a multifamily building. And we've always anticipated this would be relatively rarely used, which is what we have seen. However, even when using multifamily new construction, townhouses only can use the ERI path, and they still use the single family new homes reference design. In addition, they need to meet townhouse specific mandatory measures. So that meant that we had to add in additional measures specific for townhouses on the multifamily checklist, duplicating them from the single family checklist. For example, requiring duct leakage to the outside, and with the new sampling policy to sunset sampling for townhouses across both single family and multifamily new construction, which has increased the complexity of the program and overall has meant that a lot of people have to sift through additional requirements. As part of our overall revision goal to both reduce decision points and requirements, we have the following proposal. Get back to clicking. Okay, so here we have a proposed revision, and I just want to see how we're doing on sound.
It's great. Thank you.
Okay. So we're proposing that single family eligibility will stay the same and continue to include all detached dwellings and townhouses. And multifamily new construction eligibility will include all multifamily buildings that are not detached dwellings or townhouses. And this will allow us to remove the townhouse specific requirements from the multifamily new construction checklist. And this eligibility would be enforced with revision 5, which we anticipate to be required for buildings permitted on or after January 1st, 2026. So for all of these, we have a stakeholder comment document, and that will have questions for you guys to provide feedback, and will be posted to our stakeholder feedback page that I'll send the link at the end. For townhouses, we want to know if you agree with the proposal to allow townhouses to be certified only through the single family new homes program, and if we are missing any significant benefits to maintaining a pathway for townhouses to be certified through multifamily new construction. That was our first proposal. And now for our second proposal is to require the workbook for all buildings. So by way of background, the workbook is an Excel document that contains the rater design review and rater field checklists in Excel format. And it also contains a spot to enter all of the building efficiency features and testing results. Currently, the workbook is required for the ASHRAE and prescriptive path buildings, but is optional for the ERI path. And there is no standard template for documenting common spaces or building UA calculations for the ERI path, which causes challenges and confusion for both raters and home certification organizations and the providers that work for them. We've heard from providers that it can be challenging to know whether buildings have met this requirement, and for raters to know how to document meeting all of the common space requirements. So we are aiming to enhance the quality assurance and quality control of the program by standardizing the documentation for common spaces, as well as reducing complexity by having fewer differences between the program paths. So the proposal is to require the workbook be submitted for all buildings permitted on or after January 1st, 2026. So in the workbook, the rater checklists are always optional. You can use the PDF format or you could use them in the workbook, but you would be required to fill out the testing results and envelope information and schedules for your appliances, heating, hot water, lighting, etc. So that's what's required already for the ASHRAE and prescriptive paths and would be extended to the ERI path. However, data that's already included in the ERI model, So all of the dwelling unit testing results and the dwelling unit envelope data and the dwelling unit appliances, et cetera, does not need to be repeated in the multifamily workbook for the ERI path. That said, if you are not meeting the overall UA for dwelling units within the software and you are choosing to use the building level UA, then you would need to document the dwelling unit UA compliance in the workbook. But overall, this will be documentation for common spaces or central exhaust duct testing results. So if your buildings do not have that, then you would not have much to enter into the workbook. We also have a introduction to the multifamily workbook webinar scheduled for Monday. So if you'd like to learn more about this workbook and how to use it, especially if you want to provide feedback for us, please join us on Monday to be able to website register, and it will be a walkthrough of the workbook. For comment, we would like to know whether you agree with our proposal to require the workbook to be submitted for buildings through all paths, which would include the ERI path, or any significant benefits to not doing that, and any additional feedback you may have. As a reminder, when you expand to the ERI path, not all data has to be entered, because if you have it in the ERI model already, then you wouldn't need to enter it in the workbook. So it's mainly as standardized the documentation around the common spaces. Okay, so we made it through 2 of our proposals, and we're on to the 3rd, which is to streamline insulation and reduce thermal bridging details. The program currently requires buildings to meet mandatory requirements, and these are included on both the Rater Design Review Checklist and Rater Field Checklist. So here's what they look like on the Rater Design Review Checklist. This is the mandatory insulation backstop, and this insulation, the thermal backstop is documented either in the workbook or is calculated through your ERI model automatically. We also have on the Rater Field Checklist a section on mandatory insulation measures, first of which just ensures that you've met the requirement for the thermal backstop on the Rater Design Review Checklist, and then there's additional insulation requirements after that. And then later in our checklist, we also have mandatory details to reduce thermal bridging, which are included in section 3. And most of these are around attic edges, attic platforms, above grade walls, and slab edges, which have required insulation in order to reduce thermal bridging. These thermal bridging details improve comfort and efficiency and do provide value if the buildings are able to incorporate them. However, for a few of these particular thermal bridging details, numerous exemptions have had to be added to the program to deal with structural challenges, which has increased the program's complexity and resulted in less consistent features among certified buildings, and presented a challenge for us at EPA to try and keep up with the need for understanding the need for an exemption, for example, with the slab on grade insulation. In addition, ANSI 301 has continued to advance to better capture many of these details in the energy modeling. And we also have been getting feedback that in general on this organization of our checklist, it is confusing to have mandatory insulation details in 2 separate locations on our checklist. So with all that in mind, we are aiming with this proposal to consolidate the insulation requirements on the Rater Design Checklist, which also has a related goal to align with the single family program, which already uses a UA thermal backstop. We also want to consolidate all mandatory insulation measures into a single section of the National Rater Field Checklist and reduce the complexity of the program by making certain thermal bridging strategies optional rather than mandatory, while still continuing to promote the use of those reduced thermal bridging strategies. So how are we going to do that? Well, the proposal is to update to a UA backstop on the Rater Design Review Checklist, move all mandatory insulation requirements to section 1 of the Rater Field Checklist, and then convert section 3 from mandatory features to a list of details that must be assessed so that they can accurately be reflected in the UA calculation and final energy model. So let's take a look at each of these. First up, to update to a UA backstop, here is a mock-up of what this would look like on the Rater design review checklist, where it is much more consolidated. And given that the workbook and ERI automatically calculate the UA and the footnotes already have all of the extra information about where the requirements come from, we think this can be consolidated on the checklist itself. We are also proposing to remove from the workbook the R value and U factor tabs and only keep the UA compliance tab. So if you are using the workbook and like the R value and U factor tabs, make sure you provide feedback for us on that, as we are proposing to consolidate to just using the UA compliance tab. That was our first part of the proposal. Next was moving all of the mandatory installation requirements to section 1. So we were taking some of the thermal bridging requirements that were in section 3 and moving them into the installation section because they will still be mandatory. These include floors over ambient conditions, garages, and unconditioned spaces, as well as exterior insulation for all above grade walls, except for wood framed walls. So those will still be, those installation requirements will now all be contained in section 1, which will have all of the mandatory installation requirements. It also nicely puts the floor installation requirement right near the garage ceiling insulation requirement, which I think will help with folks who are looking at both of those requirements. And the third part of this proposal is to convert section 3 from mandatory features to details that must be assessed. So with these changes, buildings will no longer be mandated to include slab edge insulation, advanced framing, etc. However, buildings without such features will still have to compensate with others to make sure that the UA backstop and the performance target are met. We expect that certified buildings will continue to incorporate these features where they are able to, but that buildings that were previously using exemptions will continue to need to offset the UA and performance target impact by upgrading with other features. And internally, we won't have to try and figure out additional exemptions and alternatives for folks to use. So here is what the mock-up looks like for the new thermal bridging section of the Rater field checklist, where we note in both the header and the footnote that the reduced thermal bridging strategies are not mandatory, but it is mandatory to actually assess them for 301 and additional guidance for item 3.5, which I'll get to on the next slide, because that one is not covered well under 301. So these are, again, would not be mandatory anymore, but you still would need to make up for anything that you are missing with the thermal backstop and the performance target, because those aren't changing. So let's dive a little bit more into what's happening with the above grade concrete floor edge insulation adjustments. These are the details that we have our own guidance for. And so in revision 4, we added a U factor penalty instead of the insulation. And so now with this revision, we are mainly reorganizing where the requirement sits. So the main requirement on the checklist will now be to assess whether there is a thermal break at the floor edge. In other words, whether it meets one of the prescriptive insulation requirements. And if not, then you'll need to use the UA penalty. Overall, most of the existing policies will be retained that we already have and that we've already set up. And so this is mostly just a restructuring. So the current thermal break options will still exist, and the U factor penalty when the thermal break is not met will still exist with the following 2 changes. So we will require the envelope UA to be documented in the workbook, even if there is a thermal break, if these concrete edges exist in the building. That's because this information is not documented in the ERI model. So previously we had only required it when you took the UA penalty, but now we'll require it even if you are providing the thermal break. And then we are to consolidate the overall options for that thermal break. We are removing the option to insulate the floor edge down 8 feet on the exterior podium wall, given that the alternative to insulate 4 feet down on the interior and exterior of the wall performs better. So in summary, the key implications for raters: the thermal backstop will be only calculated using overall UA and removing the option for R value or U factors in the workbook. We're insulating the concrete floors and exterior insulation for non-wood frame walls continue to be mandatory, but they are moved to section 1 to consolidate all of the insulation together. Other thermal bridging requirements, including solid grade insulation, are not required, but the overall UA and performance targets are not changing, so you'll have to make up for anything that you are missing in that. And then finally, the UA penalty and prescriptive thermal break requirements for concrete floor edges remain the same, except that the workbook will be required to be used for the UA calculation if these details exist in climate zone 438, and we're removing the option to insulate the floor edge down for 8 feet on the exterior of podium walls to meet that thermal break. Okay. So we are interested in your feedback on whether you agree that converting some of the mandatory reduced thermal bridging details while eliminating the exemptions will result in comparable performance for most buildings, and if you have any feedback on the other specific elements of the proposal. Made it through the first long proposal, and then the next one, I want everybody to take a deep breath for it, and we're gonna go over transition to track A, HVAC rating by rater, and sunset track B. And then want to remind folks that we are recording this, and so I know that I'm covering a lot of information in a short amount of time, and in this particular proposal, I'll be covering a lot of information again, and so you will be able to revisit this and watch it again once it is posted, which we anticipate it should be able to be posted sometime tomorrow. Okay, so this is another one that if you were at the webinar earlier today, you heard about for the single family side, the proposal to transition to track A for the single family program. We have the same proposal for the multifamily program as well. It just has different ramifications for multifamily, so I want to cover it here as well. So as background, currently the program has 2 compliance tracks for completing HVAC design and functional testing requirements. Track A, HVAC rating by rater. Track B, HVAC testing by functional testing agent. And track A is based on standard 310, which has 5 key tests: design review, total duct leakage, blower fan airflow, blower fan watt jot, and refrigerant charge. Whereas track B requires the use of a functional testing agent who completes some of those verification tasks in lieu of the rater. And for multifamily, things get a little bit complicated because we have lots of different types of systems, and they could be located in dwelling units or common spaces. And so with the 2 tracks and the different spaces, I'll just go through on the next couple slides how that situates with our overall design and functional testing requirements. So starting off with track B, where we have specific requirements. If you have ducted residential systems serving dwelling units, then they need to meet the dwelling unit load calculations, and the rater reviews those. They also have sizing limits for the heat pump, ACs, and furnaces, and the rater ensures those have been met, as well as ensuring that when you go in the field, the equipment model is matches the design report. We also have on the functional testing checklist, functional testing of the indoor unit to make sure the heating turns on and off. Then we require the duct testing for these dwelling units, as well as when you switch over to the functional testing checklist, you need to do refrigerant charge test and airflow testing by the functional testing agent. And that's what you do for the ducted ducted residential systems, but then all the other residential systems, you need to document loads if they're a large building level system. You still need to do the model review and the indoor unit checks. And then on the functional testing checklist, if they're boilers, chillers, cooling towers, or central BRF, you need to complete the specific sections on that test for them. And then we have to look at what happens for common spaces. So for common spaces, if you have those ducted residential systems serving common spaces, for common spaces in general, you just have to document the load. There's no rater review of it, but the rater still confirms the equipment is right and the indoor units are working. And then if they're the residential ducted systems, they need to do the refrigerant charge and the airflow testing on the functional testing checklist, just like those if they were in the dwelling unit. And then when you have other systems types serving the common spaces, it basically is treated very similar to how those other systems are for the dwelling units. So this is all background on track B. I understand it might be a little overwhelming. It may help some folks who are more visual, but this is all how things are for track B currently. And then I'm going to go through track A and how that looks. And so for track A, this, instead of just being for ducted systems, it's for all residential systems serving dwelling units. You need to do those load calcs that have, and the sizing limits apply. And then the rater reviews make and model and the indoor units just like they do for track B, and the duct testing. And then you switch to doing the 310 test instead of the functional testing checklist. So you have airflow testing, watt draw, and refrigerant charge testing. Now for the other systems that are not the residential systems, it's very similar to what you would have for track B, where you document the load and you do the make and model of the indoor unit test and the functional testing checklist. When you go to the common spaces, this is where there's even more options currently. So the common space can either choose to follow the track A test and do the 310 test, or they can choose to do the functional testing checklist, and then all the other systems are treated the same way. So all in all, we have a lot of different options and a lot of decision points, and it can cause a lot of confusion. Meanwhile, adoption of standard 310 is growing, and track A offers several advantages over track B. You get third-party verification by the rater. The FT agent isn't required for those residential systems, and proper installs are rewarded with ERI points if you're using the ERI path. And mainly maintaining all of those tracks make the program really complex and unwieldy. As you can see from the previous slides, you need to figure out what is required for each track and choose which one makes sense. And then all of our documents and footnotes, etc., have to include all the information on both track A and track B need to be maintained. And in general, just with common spaces and central systems, it gets confusing to determine what is required if we have two tracks, as well as all of these different system types and locations. So with that, the goals for this are to streamline the certification workflow, simplify by aligning the design and functional testing requirements across all of the HVAC systems, and ensure verification of HVAC design and residential system installation for the purpose of the program is completed by third-party raters. So how are we going to get there? This is our proposal to sunset track B for buildings permitted on or after January 1st, 2026, which will have a single track for HVAC design and functional testing. And visually, this will be just one line where you can see what you need to do across the line. And in general, what we've done is taken from track A and consolidated everything to work for all systems. However, at this time, we are going to be requiring the 310 airflow testing, but recommending and not requiring both the watt draw and the 310 refrigerant charge. We may look into requiring those later, but right now, in the interest of trying to transition everybody to this new track, we're looking to just require the 310 airflow testing, but recommend and not require the watt draw and the refrigerant charge. And then we'll still keep the functional testing for checklist for the large central systems, the boilers, chiller, cooling towers, central BRF. So I'm going to go through how this looks. How do you get from where we just were with track B to this?
what are the changes that you're looking at? So this is the diagram for track B again. And what happens with dwelling units? Well, first, we're going to consolidate to start talking about all systems serving dwelling units. And so if something's highlighted in yellow, that means it's an adjustment. If it stays in blue, it's the same as what you were doing for track B currently. So now we're going to talk about all systems serving dwelling units, and they all need to have dwelling unit load calculations that the rater reviews. And then you also have, for all of the heat pumps, ACs, and furnaces, they will have to be subject to those sizing limits that the rater. Then the make and model and the indoor testing stay the same, as well as the duct testing. But instead of requiring the refrigerant charge from the functional testing checklist, we recommend using the 310 refrigerant charge test. And then instead of doing the functional testing info, we are requiring the 310 airflow testing. And we also are adding in from 310 the recommendation to do the 310 watt draw test as well. And then for your central systems, you will still need to do the functional testing for just those systems. That's how we consolidate for dwelling units, and then we take a look at common spaces. And similarly, we are going to consolidate to look at all the common spaces, and the documentation of the loads is just staying the same with lining on the model and the indoor units. But again, we are now adding in duct testing for common space systems. We are making the refrigerant charge a recommendation to do the 310 refrigerant charge and switching to the 310 airflow testing requirement for common spaces. And similarly, having the recommendation for the 310 watt draw. And then for those large systems, again, they use the functional testing checklist still. So you'll notice that now we've lined up between the dwelling units and common spaces, except for the load calculations. And then we'll just switch this order to align with the 310 order. And here we have our resulting streamlined option. And then if we just combine the loads, we get our single path for everything. Now I want to just walk through each of these so that you can understand better what we are saying for each step along the way. So first is the load documentation and rater review requirements. Again, for dwelling units, we're now saying that all dwelling unit loads need to be documented and reviewed per standard 310. So this is removing the previous exemptions based on equipment type that existed from track B. We're not changing anything. We're not proposing to change anything for common spaces. For the documentation side, we are still proposing to keep the allowance to use the standard 310 documentation plus our Energy Star supplements, or use a building level HVAC design report that will be updated to accommodate the 310 review. We understand that for multifamily, it can be important to have that building level design report. So we're not planning to sunset that like they are for the single family program, although I'm interested in feedback if folks have on that. We also, for the rater review, we're going to remove the track B section from the rater design review checklist with some minor edits to track A. We're also going to add the data from the 310 data tool so that into the workbook so you can document your review of the design and as well as the testing results. And then we move to sizing. So similar to the documentation, the main change for sizing is that the sizing requirement is for all systems. So we are removing the previous exemptions that existed from track B. And then in addition, we have heard that these are the sizing limits for all indoor units and units serving just one dwelling unit. However, for central systems, sizing is important. And we've heard that oversized VRFs can lead to a dramatic reduction in efficiency and significantly increased first costs. They can end up oversized if the loads for the outdoor unit are not based on the actual loads of the units themselves. So we're proposing new documentation for the load serving each outdoor unit and a sizing percentage. And this will be just for all ACs or heat pumps that serve multiple dwelling units or common spaces. So generally speaking, central VRFs. And here is an example of this filled out. It is all for awareness. So we're having them calculate a percentage, but there isn't a sizing limit proposed at this time. It's something that we may consider for the future to actually have a limit. But right now it's just an awareness measure given the importance of the sizing of the outdoor unit. Moving on to the indoor unit functional testing. So section 5 of the functional testing checklist will be moved to the radar field checklist. No change to the actual requirements, but this means that you don't need to fill out that functional testing checklist for most buildings unless you have those large central systems. And so it will be included in section 5 of the radar field checklist now for most items. And then one item will be moved to section 7 for the ventilation section. I'm going to duct leakage. I think here's where the first real change is. So dwelling units, the duct leakage will basically stay the same, except we're going to rephrase to reference grade 1 per standard 310 just to streamline the requirement, but keep the same intent. We will still have the more stringent testing result limits for systems with no ducted returns, but that will be included in the footnote. But for common spaces, we will now be required to meet the duct leakage limit for systems serving common spaces where the indoor unit has a capacity up to 65 kBTU for cooling and 125 for heating. So this is a big change. Instead of needing to fill out the functional testing checklist, you'll need to do both duct testing and then the airflow testing, which we'll get to in a sec. And here is just a screenshot of what that will look like. And then we get to airflow testing. So for airflow testing, this is new for both dwelling units and common spaces. If you were not using, if you were using track B, you'll be required to do airflow testing per standard 310 for all systems serving common spaces or dwelling units that have indoor units with cooling capacities up to 65 kBTUH or heating capacities up to 125 kBTUH. And you will no longer need to do sections 2 and 3 of the airflow and refrigerant charge testing on the functional testing checklist. And then this is how section 5 will be updated. In addition to requiring airflow testing, we will have the recommendation for the watt draw and the refrigerant charge listed there. And then finally, for the functional testing checklist, sections 2 through 5 will be removed, and the functional testing checklist will only be required for central VRF, boilers, chillers, and cooling towers. And we won't be changing any of the requirements for this. It will just be limiting when you need to fill that. So overall, here's a summary of the key points for you guys as raters. You need to complete any mandatory training prior to using 310. You need to collect load calculations for all dwelling units, regardless of system type, and complete those design reviews for 310 for all dwelling units. Meet sizing limits for previously exempted systems, and begin measuring duct leakage for ducted residential sized indoor units serving common spaces, and begin measuring airflow for the residential sized indoor units serving both dwelling units and common spaces. And then you will only use the functional testing checklist for central VRFs, boilers, chillers, and cooling towers. We think this has a lot of benefits to reduce complexity and have everybody using the same track and align all the requirements across the systems and the spaces, and streamline what's required for common spaces, as well as remove a significant number of requirements and footnotes, and overall enhance the quality control by requiring rater verification of the HVAC flow for most system types. As a reminder, in the future, we may consider requiring tasks 4 and 5, the watt draw and the refrigerant charge, also be completed. So for this, we want to hear from you on whether you agree that it's appropriate to sunset track B, and we are very interested in whether you think for common spaces, the duct leakage limits are achievable when served by residential sized indoor units, as well as the airflow testing for those common spaces. Okay, I'm going to move right along because we got a few more proposals to get through, and I know time, we got only a little bit more time. So the next one is a lot lighter. It's for streamlining the mandatory lighting requirements. For background, common spaces, current lighting efficiency requirements include 90% LEDs are required based on the multifamily reference design for the ERI path and prescriptive path. And then for version 1.1, 90% LEDs are required for the lighting power density. 90% LEDs are required, or you can use a lighting power density alternative and 90% fluorescent lighting or LEDs. And all of these requirements are listed in 2 separate items, one of which has you reference back to the Energy Star Multifamily Reference Design, which is located on the National Program Requirements. And there are lengthy footnotes involved with this. So for this revision, we are interested in simplifying the program by removing requirements, reducing alternatives, and reducing the references back to the multifamily reference design from the radar field checklist that requires people to keep checking back and forth. So we are proposing to require 90% LEDs in common spaces for all paths and all versions, remove the alternative option for version 1.1 to meet an LPD limit of 90% CFL LED efficiency. This will require lighting to be documented in the multifamily workbook for the ASHRAE path, where previously they had only had to document it in the ASHRAE path calculator. This is how the section on the radar field checklist will be updated, where we will get rid of an item and simplify a couple, and we will be able to remove a lot of footnotes. So we are interested in whether you agree with this proposal to require 90% LEDs in all of common spaces. And then I'm going to move right to consolidating the ASHRAE path performance target and documentation and adding a fuel neutral approach. And for this, if you're just catching your breath for a second, if you're not doing ASHRAE path, you can make sure to type in any questions that may come up on the proposals we have already covered into the Q&A box. So for background, for folks who are involved in the ASHRAE path, our current ASHRAE path version 1.1 performance target and documentation table is up here, where there are 3 different levels based on the state code, each of which has multiple options for the performance target, which result in different Appendix G used for modeling and different documentation based on that. And so there is a lot of complexity going on with all of these, trying to figure out and maintain all of these documentation and all of these levels. And we have looked into it, and 95% of the recent ASHRAE path certifications are from states that already are at the 90.1, 2016, or 2019 levels. Furthermore, while this has been happening, DOE has created a standard 90.1 compliance form, and it supports modeling from 90.1 2016 or later. And this is great because it's an Excel format that can actually import from multiple simulation tools. It has enhanced QA for the modeler and the MRO. It's fully supported by DOE. It's been adopted by some other codes and locations, as well as has free training associated with it from DOE. So we think this form is a great option for many reasons. They have also developed, along with the compliance form, a compliance form companion tool, which is an additional Excel workbook that allows customization by programs. And this works in conjunction with the compliance form. So you can customize it. We have customized it for the Energy Star and Zero Energy Ready programs so that it will have specific instructions for our program, our specific target included, and it also has specific metrics that we allow, such as source energy and cost savings. It also has the ability to have the calculation of fuel neutral savings included. And why is this important? So starting with 90.1 2016 Appendix G, buildings needed to model a baseline with a specific fuel regardless of what was in the certified building. So for multifamily buildings, that means that gas water heating is in all climate zones, electric heating in climate zone 1 through 3A, and gas heating for 3B and up. And having this is inconsistent with how it's modeled in the ERI and previous 90.1 editions, which would have apples to apples fuel-based modeling. Ultimately, this creates a more stringent target for the all-electric buildings. And so it's a challenge given the cost of electricity compared to the cost of gas. We, for our program, allow folks to use either the cost savings or the source energy savings, but even source energy savings does not fully mitigate the challenge from this baseline change. So we are proposing a few different things. First, to have one performance target and documentation. So for version 1.1, we're proposing that performance target will change to 15% over 90.1 2016. 95% of projects already have this as their target. This would require modeling to ASHRAE 90.1 2016 or later. And then for all buildings using the ASHRAE path, including version 1.2, we'll need to use the DOE compliance form and the Energy Star companion tool. So we will be able to sunset the ASHRAE path calculators and instead work with an industry standard and DOE supported tool. We are also proposing to add a new fuel neutral performance approach. And so buildings will, with this new approach, would be able to comply with our 15% savings target using energy costs, source energy, or the fuel neutral calculations. So this new fuel neutral approach is available with the customized companion tool. You export the data from the compliance form into the companion tool, and you can see the results calculated there. It uses component loads to adjust for a fuel neutral baseline. And here's what the results look like. So you'll have two tables that you want to reference. Table 4 is the compliance calculations, and you can see your percent over 90.1 2019 listed here. It could also be 2016 depending on the version, and that will show you the cost savings and source savings, which are the traditional things we currently allow. And then we are proposing to look at table 5 fuel neutral compliance calculations, which would show you the fuel neutral calculated savings target. We are very interested in feedback on this approach before we finalize whether to include it and also the specific calculations involved. So we will post on the website instructions on how to use the tool to calculate fuel neutral savings, and that will be posted. And then to provide feedback, we want you to submit the compliance form companion tool and a list of the building efficiency features along with your comments that will be in the stakeholder feedback form. These additional documents will help us understand what's happening with your building and whether the fuel neutral approach is working appropriately. And it can be used on any building that has a fuel switch in the baseline. So, summary of our overall changes. All buildings will be modeled using Appendix G from 90.1 2016 or later. All ASHRAE models would be documented using the DOE compliance form and companion tool. And it's important to note there's free training available for both of those, which is great. The performance target for version 1.1 would be consolidated to 15% savings over 90.1 2016. And we would add a new fuel neutral approach that could be used. So we want to get your feedback on all of those, on whether updating to the performance target makes sense and the documentation makes sense. And if you have buildings that you've modeled, we would greatly appreciate input on the fuel neutral calculation and whether it is working as anticipated. Okay. So now folks who had tuned out because you don't do ASHRAE, you can tune back in if you are in California. So this is specific to California and the transition to whole building modeling in California. California version 1.2 and 1.3 originally had a dwelling unit modeling path for low rise, which would be 10% better than Title 24 or 3DR points per unit. So you model each unit separately. Common spaces would meet these prescriptive requirements in the California program requirements, and you go through an HCO. Then you also had an option to do the whole building modeling that would be 10% better than Title 24 on a building level, but oversight would be performed by an MRO. In 2024-2022, it moved all multifamily to a multifamily code chapter and required the whole building modeling. And so for version 1.4, we were able to create a single path for all buildings where it would be whole building modeling 10% better than code. We wouldn't need the common space prescriptive measures in the California program requirements, and buildings could all follow the same ASHRAE path requirements in the National Radar Checklist. And then based on code, low rise would be submitted to HCOs and high rise submitted to MROs because that would align with the California processes for code. We got feedback last year that multifamily buildings, even under 2016 and 2019, would model all dwelling units together and not individually. And common spaces were sometimes and mostly generally included if they existed because they'd be smaller, but sometimes they'd be in a separate model. And these were all submitted through their California HERS provider for code. And so we put in a policy to allow a building level model to be submitted to an HCO, but we still kept the common space prescriptive requirements for these because it wasn't clear whether the common spaces would always be included. And so for these, you could submit to either an HCO or an MRO if you were doing this building level model. But we did plan to propose a larger consolidation, so we haven't updated the program documents. And we are proposing for 1.2 and 1.3 to have one performance target of 10% better than code on a building level. So if common spaces and dwelling units are modeled in two separate models, then both must separately meet the 10% over code target. We don't think that very many buildings will need that. They would all have one path. All the buildings would follow the this whole building path. And when looking at the Rater field checklist and design checklist, they use the ASHRAE path requirements. We'd be able to remove the common space prescriptive requirements entirely. The oversight would follow the code, and so low rise would be submitted through HCOs and high rise would be submitted through MROs. And this would be required for buildings permitted on or after January 1st, 2026. So we think this will really consolidate things for California, but we are interested in knowing whether you agree that building level 10% target makes sense and whether any multifamily dwelling units are actually still modeled separately for code under these Title 2016, Title 24, 2016, or 2019. And then if those common spaces had to be modeled separately, would a 10% target still be reasonable? I appreciate that. And we made it through all of them. And so we've covered these 7 key proposals. And as a reminder, there's still the 3 others that also are applicable from the single family webinar earlier. And while these won't be the only changes to revision 5, we felt these warranted stakeholder feedback before we proceeded further. So with that, we are starting a 4-week stakeholder period tomorrow. You can visit the feedback page for a copy of the slides, a recording, the feedback form, and those additional resources to provide feedback on that fuel neutral approach for the ASHRAE path. Please submit your comments to the inbox seen here, and we will post the outcome in this fall or winter with the release of revision 5. So appreciate everybody's time and attention here. I know we took up pretty much the full time between the audio issues and just the amount of content. So I think we can take a couple limited questions, but we will reply to folks who submitted questions and follow up after the webinar if we are not able to answer them now.
All right. So Rebecca, Gayatri, and I have been actively responding to people who have asked questions. So I think we have covered mostly everyone. If you do have additional questions, feel free to send us an email, and I'll just reiterate for a few people that wanted to review some of the proposals. The slides will be provided as well as a recording, so you can review those resources at a later time as well.
And I'll just piggyback on that. I think a lot of the questions based on the slides on the multifamily workbook proposal, Rebecca, if folks didn't get that webinar invitation for Monday, I think because maybe some folks on the call aren't as familiar, there was a lot of questions about that workbook and how it operates. So join us on Monday for that webinar.
Yes, great. And Chris, maybe we can include that in the email to everybody.
I will. I'll include a link to that.
Okay, well, thank you to you guys for answering on the fly the questions, and thank you again for everybody's attention. And please do make sure you look up the the slides and the proposals and give us your feedback. I think we can